and it'll be on Spotify most likely in 2 days. So we're going to go to the recording in three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. You guys know that I just love studying how humans think, and this book hits the nail on the head. It's called Hidden Games: The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. And we have the author here, or one of the authors, Erez Yoeli. Thanks so much for being here, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of this. What made you fall in love with understanding how humans think and how game theory really does play a factor?
Oh gosh, the human story. It let's take us back about 15 years, maybe 12, 13 years, something like that. And I had just wrapped up some work on my dissertation and was talking to the other author of this book, and he has a tendency to ask why one more time than you expect. You know, kind of like that 5-year-old, except there's actually a logic behind it. And so he's asking me like, okay, so why did you get the results that you got? And I'm giving him an answer. And he says, no, no, but why? And and I pause for a second and I think, I don't know. And he said, what do you mean by why? What kind of why question is that? And what he really meant was you had documented some sort of weird psychological phenomenon, but we didn't really understand where it came from. And it would be cool to be able to understand where such phenomena come from. And that kind of started us on this path of trying to understand that. We specifically were starting with understanding why people are good to each other and why they're good to each other in kind of quirky ways, which is a topic that takes up about a quarter of the book. And so our conversations kind of started there, which isn't where the book starts, but that's how it began. And we would just kind of sit in the hot tub and yell at each other about how each other were wrong until we started to converge.
Can you explain what game theory is? Because I believe
Absolutely.
I believe everything is a chess game in this world. So I'm a kid at heart, and I think if life is a game, you can play it. And so the more I realize that, the more I figure out that it leverage positioning and timing, I can win more games. So can you explain that?
Game theory is a tool that actually did start, it kind of got its start analyzing games like chess. In fact, famously analyzing poker. It began in the 1940s. There was this guy, John von Neumann, who was just this crazy genius. He died young, or he would have won like 9 Nobel Prizes. And he begins to use this tool to try to understand strategic interactions, like the kind of interaction that you have in a poker game or a chess game, where what I do, what's best for me to do depends on what you do, and what's best for you to do depends on what I do. And there's this like recursion problem that you have to solve. And so he developed this math toolkit that basically helps you solve it. After he worked on it, there was this guy, John Nash, from the movie A Beautiful Mind, who helped to kind of refine some of the ideas there. The most famous tool in game theory is called the Nash equilibrium after him. And they're all kind of designed for understanding these kinds of situations. In real life, not in games, those kinds of situations pop up all the time too. So think about two firms that are thinking about how to price. I want to price as high as possible, but if the other guy is pricing lower than me, then he's going to get all the business. If you think about whether to merge with another company, or if you're the government thinking about whether to allow a merger, then you want to be thinking about what all of the different players are doing. And game theory is a good tool for thinking about that because these companies' decisions depend on what the other person is doing. Auctions are another context. International relations are another context where it's been used a lot. We took it in a different direction to try to understand human psychology, but the classic applications are those I just gave.
I watched a documentary on how fast the gut is as compared to the mind. And they actually did evaluate how individuals play poker. And one of the studies included just trying to guess the next card. And eventually they realized that the gut is faster than the mind. And the way they are able to evaluate that is they're able to tap into understanding the blood pressure and the heart rate. And so it's almost like the instincts of the individual kind of knew if the card was going to be higher or lower at a certain point at a very subconscious level. But the longer the person made a decision in their brain and started to evaluate all the variables, they made a worse decision. I think that's called Parkinson's law. I think that's part of it, where the longer you wait about making a decision, the more variables enter your brain, and therefore it kind of throws you off. And so, is there anything like that that you talk about in the book of how usually gut instinct is there. It's within you for survival instincts. But the more you ignore it, the more you're punished by it.
Yeah, actually, this ties very closely to a core theme in the book. So there's this critique of tools like game theory. It's not the only tool that gets critiqued, but it's one of them, for assuming that people are these like homo economicus that can do any kind of rationalization perfectly, and that like all of the econ models kind of depend on that, and that in practice people kind of are so at reasoning. We can do some reasoning, but we have a lot of mistakes. There's this wonderful book by Steven Pinker called Rationality recently that covers a lot of these common mistakes. There's Nobel Prizes assigned to people who have documented these mistakes. Richard Thaler most recently. There's this whole field of behavioral economics that Thaler helped to found, which has come up to try to address this issue. And yet we're taking this toolkit and we're saying, in fact, the good place to use it isn't when people are thinking really hard and trying to be rational. It's precisely to try to understand their gut instincts, their preferences, their beliefs, the things they don't know where they come from, and they just kind of feel and think. That's actually where the rationality tends to apply more. And so it's very closely aligned with this argument that sometimes, in fact, those instincts are better than our reasoning and more rational.
Mm-hmm. So chapter 4, I mean, I wanted to kind of start off with that question because what they found out was that women have better gut instincts than men. And it's usually a little bit more accurate. And maybe that's where the mother's intuition phrase has come from. So they have to be. And I don't know if that ties in with chapter 4. You talk about sex ratios, the gold standard of game theory. So can you tell us a little bit about this chapter?
The sex ratios chapter is about why do we tend to see in nature that in most species there are about 50-50 males to females. The answer that my bio teacher gave me was that so that when we reach adulthood, we would each have a mate of the opposite sex. But my bio teacher apparently has never met an elephant seal or an ant or any other species, most of which are not monogamous.
Yeah.
So this was not a particularly good answer. And it turns out that there is a game theoretic answer. It's one of the classic applications of game theory in biology. I'll hold off from giving it for a second, but basically what we were doing in the book was showing that it's not really like if you're sitting here now trying to think about where this comes from, it's not so obvious. So the answer that, for instance, my bio teacher gave is pretty intuitive. It's wrong, and so what we wanted to do was highlight how game theory is really good at finding counterintuitive solutions to things that maybe don't have intuitive answers. So that's where it fits into the book. In terms of the answer itself, it turns out the reason is simply because suppose that you had a population where the number of males was very low. The way that sexual reproduction happens, every child has one male parent and one female parent, which means that say you have one male and 99 females in a population, and you have in the next generation also has 100 offspring. That male is having 100 children, whereas the females are having basically one child on average. And if you're a grandparent, you'd much rather have a male offspring so that you have 100 grand offspring. And so you'll skew the sex ratio. And obviously the biology will do this for you through mutations and so on and so forth, but you would like to skew the sex ratio. Same is true if you have very few females, except you would prefer to have a female offspring. And basically the only place where there's parity, the only place where you don't want to deviate is at a 50-50 sex ratio. That's the logic of a Nash equilibrium. The logic of a Nash equilibrium is a point where nobody really wants to deviate given what other people are doing. And so this is the only Nash equilibrium of this game, and it's why that so many species have a 50-50 sex ratio, and it's a nice way to illustrate Nash and power game theory and so on.
Wow. So from what I understood, I thought it was women are being born at a much higher rate than men. But across maybe I'm just looking at certain parts of the United States or even just the United States, across the world, you're still saying that it's about a 50-50 ratio? Still to
That's
this
right.
day?
So yeah. So even humans who have the ability to do sex selective abortion, we have sex ratios that are pretty close to 50-50. You do tend to skew towards males a little bit. But But yeah, it's roughly 50-50. Obviously, China, for instance, one child policy, you'll
Yep.
find more males, things like that. But even there, it's something like 55-45 or something like that.
That is crazy. Wow. And so do you think it's just natural selection or just the biology? I mean, is it human reproduction? It's a survival mechanism. Is that what you're saying that nature is doing this? Is that it?
That's right. Yep. And nature is using it is displaying the Nash equilibrium logic, because basically every single individual is subject to this incentive to have as many grand offspring as possible. And as a consequence, we get stuck at 50-50.
Wow. That's interesting. I had to look that up. I want to move forward to chapter 10, the repeated prisoner's dilemma and altruism. When I read that, I'm like, oh, I got to tap into this one and just touch on it for a little bit. So, what is this all about?
Speaking of natural selection, one of the things that really puzzled Darwin was how is it possible that an individual will sometimes help another individual? They'll pay a cost to benefit another. And he knew that throughout the animal kingdom, this was very common. And in fact, he highlighted that humans are particularly good at cooperation of this kind, altruism of this kind. The word is usually cooperation in the biology space. So I'll use that word. And it's indeed true that humans are exceptional cooperators. We usually think of ourselves as not very good at cooperating, but it's in fact not true. We stand out as being quite good at it. And so that's the puzzle. Where does that come from? There are a bunch of answers. There isn't just like a single source of how animals successfully overcome this. It took a long time before we got to some of those answers. About 100 years after Darwin was mulling this question over before we started getting cool, really solid answers to this. In the 1970s, it kind of begins. And one of the core threads is this game theoretic answer that says, suppose that you and I meet up and we have an opportunity to help each other, but then we never see each other again. Not going to get much cooperation in that kind of context. No altruism, because there's not really anything that allows us to cooperate and get something back in return that will somehow benefit us down the road. But what happens if we meet again and again and again? It doesn't have to be for sure that we'll meet, just some probability that you and I meet again. Well, now these future interactions can serve as an incentive for current interactions to be more helpful to one another. And there's various ways that can happen. We use the repeated prisoner's dilemma to illustrate this. It's a very famous game. The way it works is the two prisoners face two choices, either cooperate or defect. Cooperation carries some cost, but benefits the other by some benefit. The benefit is considered to be bigger than the cost, so that it kind of makes sense socially for the two of them combined to both cooperate. And that's it. That's the whole game. If we analyze this game in a one-shot situation, the only Nash equilibrium of the game is for the two players to defect, unfortunately. Hence the dilemma. They could be better off if they cooperated, but they did not. We predict that they do not. But if we repeat this with some probability delta, just some number between 0 and 1, then and we repeat it over and over and over again, that there are lots of equilibria in which the players do cooperate.
Yeah, I guess it's the law of reciprocity, and I think it might have been Napoleon Hill or one of those guys that talked about it, where you basically the more you look at everything as a relationship, the more you give, you will receive, whether it's directly or indirectly, and it could be from their network or people they know. But the act of giving does do something internally that says, I need to reciprocate this, right? And I think entrepreneurs have understood this, that the more they give value with information or a free sample or something that they could give of value, an individual will value it to such a high degree that eventually, when a problem becomes so great, they, number one, think of that person, but number two, give up a resource to obtain something from that individual or that business. So is that tied into this, that if you look at every
Yeah.
client or business partner as a real relationship, there has to be a give and take every step of the way, almost like you go outside and you play football, you play and toss, and a little bit of give and take, and eventually a relationship is formed. Therefore, you become stronger next week than you are today.
100%. So what we do in this chapter that you were alluding to earlier is talk about the features of these equilibria. And the very first one we talk about is they have to involve reciprocity. We define that very simply as if you cooperate now, it's more likely that others will cooperate with you in the future. A cooperative equilibrium has to have that feature. And it makes sense. If it didn't have that feature, there would be no reason to cooperate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, while you were talking, it made me think of a Jordan Peterson talk. And he said, if you're married to a woman and she's out of control, do you really want to yell at her and put her in her place and make her feel bad? Because if you do that, you're going to be a winner and she's going to feel like a loser. Now, look deep inside your soul. Do you really want to be married to a loser? So the goal is not just to dominate and to win at all times. It's to play the game so each of you are benefiting and therefore wanting to continue this game. So I'm assuming you're a Jordan Peterson fan. That ties directly with this. Is that right?
It does tie to this pretty closely. I think it also ties to another question that probably many listeners are having is coming to mind, which is sometimes if people are too explicitly thinking about this kind of stuff, it feels a little bit like
Fake.
transactional or
Yeah,
even dirty
fake.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so a lot of the times we really don't trust those people as much. And there are actually game theoretical arguments we can make to try to understand where that comes from.
Man. So when I'm thinking of hustlers at a poker game, or let's just say pool game, I used to play pool. The people would come off as like they don't really know what they're doing, and therefore individuals are more likely to play them, right? And it's very much like the color of money. If you come out and you're the dominating force, individuals will be scared to play with you because they are going to lose. I think one of the benefits is that in order for you to succeed in life, you are going to play lots of games. And in order for that to happen, or for other people to want to play with you, you have to be invited to play lots of games. This is another Jordan Peterson philosophy. So make it very easy for others to invite you to their game. Be likable, keep your word, right? Don't burn bridges. And also, I guess you could say, hang around the right people because you are a reflection of your network. And so being invited to lots of games is part of game theory. Is that right?
I mean, I would say that game theory helps us understand the benefits and the ways to ensure that you are invited to a lot of games. So these strategies that people like Peterson and Peterson himself are describing are ways to basically build trust. And you can think of being very consistent as one way to build trust. People who flip flop are less trustworthy. Think back to the famous campaign that George Bush put up against John Kerry for flip flopping on various issues, which was really effective. Or another example of this is the one we just talked about, where somebody is thinking about things a little too deeply, and always thinking about the benefits to themselves before they decide to agree to help out. Well, that's somebody that won't help unless there's some benefit to themselves, and so you don't trust them as much. And contrast that with somebody who's very principled and always seems to be doing things for sort of a higher along some sort of higher cause or higher reason. Even if there's somebody you don't agree with, then they're often somebody who you think, okay, but like they're somewhat trustworthy. Religious people often have that characteristic. We do trust religious people more, studies show, and they do tend to, in fact, cooperate across a wider range of contexts. So it makes sense that we do.
While you're doing research for this book, was there anything that really stands out to you that was shocking that you may have not known beforehand, but you use to this day or think about that helps you potentially be invited to more games or understand it at a deeper level? Anything really that is at the top of the list, if you will?
There are a few things. I'm going to choose this one. One of the things that people like me who study human behavior can come off as is because we're constantly thinking about why we do things and why other people do things, we can come off as untrustworthy. And because we're just like analyzing everything. If the stereotype of an economist, that's somebody nobody likes. And one of the things that I understood better by trying to understand this topic that we're talking about now about trust is that sometimes it's just better that even if I'm thinking about these things to kind of stick to certain principles. And so I kind of entrenched into certain principles that guide how I behave interpersonally. And maybe I selected some of those principles in a somewhat strategic way, but once I selected them, I stuck with them no matter what. And sometimes that can be a pain. But I think that helped to fix this issue, this interpersonal issue that I sometimes faced, where people saw me as being a little bit too strategic or self motivated, motivated to help oneself.
Got it. What about groupthink mentality? Did you notice anything amongst how it's pretty easy to dissect a culture because there is a survival mechanism that back in the caveman days, if you were an outsider, you were certain to die. And so nowadays we still have that. And if we're afraid to lose that group approval, fear also potentially makes us make the decision that's the most popular. So there's actually like a chain reaction that the moment you're an outsider, fear enters your mind. Therefore, it's almost you have to run back to the circle or you go out into the unknown and kind of fight for yourself. So groupthink mentality probably is something that you came across, and that's how you can really break down someone's decision making.
Groupthink is definitely a thing. There's no question about that.
Well, you're in
Uh,
California. You know better than most, I think.
it's definitely a thing. I also don't want to get kicked out,
Yeah.
but there are. It's not the. It's not the only thing. It's not the only game in town. And so it's like important to understand that there are also currents pushing against groupthink. There is and a large reward for being the person who discovers something that's valuable and others weren't thinking about because they were group thinking. And there are lots of individuals out there who are kind of exploring in that way. And different individuals have faced different incentives and have different skills. And so some people will be more group thinkish and some people will be more of the kind that break the mold.
Hmm. Yeah, you said reward there, and I want to get to that because that was chapter 15, the hidden role of primary rewards. I have known from being around many entrepreneurs, we have an incentive, a drive within us to maybe go out into the unknown and find the gold, but it's dangerous, it's scary, there's not many people around, you have to be self-reliant, but that's what we shoot for. We want that adventure. So that is why we risk it all to build these businesses and put ourselves on the line because the juice is worth the squeeze. Can you tell us a little bit about chapter 15, the hidden role of primary rewards? And I think the more you know yourself, the more you realize how you can manufacture dopamine in the brain and maybe incentivize yourself on a daily basis.
Sure. I'm going to tell you about chapter 15. It's going to sound like it has nothing to do with this, and then I'll tie it back in.
Good deal. Okay,
Um,
good deal. All right.
Chapter 15, the overarching idea there was to basically say, look, this book was about game theory, but actually game theory was kind of the means to the ends. And we're kind of going to point out that it's really just a tool. You need to dig a hole, you get a spade. And really, the whole point of digging the hole was to try to get below the ground. And the interesting thing was what was going on underground. And so, if you happen to have a different tool to get underneath that's more appropriate for the particular ground you're digging in, that might be good too. And that's what the chapter is about. It's really about pointing out that game theory is cool, but the really cool thing it was doing was helping us to uncover the hidden incentives that were shaping our psychology. It's really the hidden incentives that are cool. And so it's a bit of a bait and switch. That's what the chapter is ostensibly about. But how does it tie into the question you just asked? One of the main things that we argue both in that chapter and then also earlier is that these hidden incentives include all sorts of sort of fundamental things that most humans tend to like, and that they kind of shape the other things that we learn to like. What kind of things do they tend to be? Well, obviously money, resources, but that's one thing most people like. More money, more resources is something most people prefer. More mating opportunities, people tend to prefer that. More power, people like that. People prefer to be healthy and comfortable than to be sick. Those are examples of the kinds of things that we think are really fundamental things that are kind of universally loved by everybody and that help to guide what people come to like more. And one of the key things that we point out there is that notice that is not the same as just money. There are other things people like too. And think about like entrepreneurship as a very clear example of this. We know that in fact there is what's known as the entrepreneurship premium gap in the finance literature, whereby companies, entrepreneurs make a lower return on investment on average, when you look across all of the different entrepreneurship efforts, including the ones that fail, obviously the ones who succeed make a lot of money, but the ones that fail don't. And so when you look across the whole portfolio of entrepreneurship in the United States, it's actually doing worse than just an S&P 500. Why? Well, there's obviously something else that these people are getting from this other than money. There's some sort of satisfaction of being your own boss, of coming up with your own idea, of contributing to society in your own way that society is giving back to you. And that's another kind of primary reward other than just money. And so we talk about those kinds of things and how they end up shaping what we like for instance, becoming an entrepreneur.
Hmm. When I hear the phrase game theory, I always think of dating. And I think somebody out there maybe thinks the same way as I did or do. Um, is there anything in the book that maybe will help someone maybe attract that mate? And the older I get, the more I realize that women and men are playing they're two different games, right? We're hoping to play together, but we are actually we have two different strategies, I guess. I think men are more like dogs, and I think women are more like cats. And a dog that tries to run towards a cat too fast scares off the cat, right? And so there's two different approaches. But for any guy out there, or even any woman listening, is there anything in this book that can maybe help them obtain that mate a little easier?
I'd say there are some things that could be useful to understand from the book that could help out. So, for instance, you were just talking about overeagerness. We talk about overeagerness in the book. Where does it come from? Why do we actually read from somebody who's overeager something negative? You would actually think that this wouldn't happen. Somebody who very clearly displays an interest in somebody is providing them with valuable information, or somebody who immediately tells somebody about all of their positive features. I have a lot of money. I went to a very good school. My parents have many powerful friends, all of that stuff. You would think that that's valuable information this person would want to know. And instead, we kind of think of that as tacky. Why does that kind of over eagerness or lack of modesty actually backfire? Well, the book talks about that in the chapters on costly signaling and modesty. Another
Wait,
chapter that I
so
think,
please summarize that a little bit. Like,
oh,
why
sorry.
is that? Is it because individuals who are too thirsty, is the phrase that I hear out there, that it's almost like individuals don't trust that based off of past experiences?
It's a little different. It's actually, but it is still somewhat common sense. The game theory just kind of helps to clarify it. It's really that people who can afford to hold back, to bury their good attributes are pretty confident those attributes will eventually come out, and that in and of itself becomes this signal of I actually have a lot of good attributes, not just the one that I have to show you right now.
Oh, man, is that hit on with a lot of things that I've read and even evaluated in my life. That's a great point there. So holding back, and that's why you see the confident men out there. They don't have to say their whole bio. They don't have to do X, Y, and Z because it's shining through in their tonality, possibly through their body language, possibly just through their energy.
That's right. And the other thing that it also does is it kind of signals to the person, hey, I'm planning on being around for a little while. So, like, if you don't find this out now, you'll find it out later. And so it indicates that you're not just interested in a one night stand. And assuming you're not, then you don't have to hurry to tell everybody everything good about you.
Wow, that's really good advice, guys. Take that to the bank because that doesn't just apply to dating, it does apply to everything else, right? Why give the full book when you can give little samples, knowing that if you're going to be able to share this story together, whether it's in a business sense or in a relationship, save all the good stuff for later. Don't put it all out in the beginning. It's good.
That's right. Though you have to be a little bit careful because there are some contexts where you are expected to put your best foot forward. And if you don't say something, it's assumed that you don't have it. Business contexts can be more like this. So if you fail to point out a strength of your business to a potential investor, your investor will assume that your business doesn't have that strength. And in fact, we talk about that in the evidence games chapters.
Oh man, that's great, dude. That's solid advice. I'm glad you brought that up. So, outside of your own book, is there any other book that you recommend to our listeners or our viewers? Because I'm a just an absolute student of the game, and when it comes to just investing or understanding my personality, I'm fascinated with learning tips and tricks. Any defining moment in your life when you read a book that you could share with our audience?
My absolute favorite science book is an oldie. It's Dawkins's The Selfish Gene. And it was the inspiration for using game theory in the way that we did for this book. If a reader hasn't yet read it, it's going to flip your world over its head. It's like it's completely mind blowing.
Wait, what's it called? I got to write that down.
It's called The Selfish Gene. I
Selfish.
feel super unoriginal recommending it because it's one of the most famous science books ever, and it's like on a lot of people's top list in my fields. It's fantastic.
I got to check that out. Have you ever read the book The Molecule of More?
No.
Okay, so it's all about dopamine. And
Oh, okay.
I want to make sure that I touch on this because I would assume that this comes up in this book, but maybe I'm wrong. Dopamine, pretty much the drug that runs every man, right? We're all searching for that dopamine. Some people can internally manufacture it, but others will need something external, whether it's a drug, an alcohol, a woman, or something that a car. And is there any factor of that in this book? Have you noticed any type of biological sense that that's really how we're able to be defined is based off of how much dopamine is in our brain and how we get it?
One of the things this book is trying to do is to kind of lay a foundation for when we're going to release things like dopamine. So why do emotions work the way that they do, and why they don't always just release dopamine all the time. So you would think, okay, like dopamine's fun. Why doesn't it just fire? But really, like the dopamine system is pretty highly tuned. It works pretty well to motivate us to like succeed in life. And it fires after we've done something that is like pretty well tied to success in life. Not perfectly, and you can kind of cheat it, especially if you're like injecting stuff. Um, but it is at least developed in a way that was kind of designed to help us succeed. And so this book kind of takes the approach that by thinking about those incentives, those hidden rewards that you were talking about earlier, we can kind of understand why the dopamine system works the way that it does a little bit better.
Have you read Jordan Peterson's book at all?
No, I've watched his talks and I've read some of his papers.
Have you read about the study or heard his study on, or it's not his study, but he quotes it quite a bit, the rats being chased by a cat? Have you heard of that study?
No, I know the stuff on well, I know a bunch of other rat studies.
Yeah,
Maybe
so
not
this
this
might
one.
be the same one, but basically they broke it down and said, okay, what motivates a rat more? Is it a starving rat that's going to finally get its food and eat its cheese? And so they set up a maze and they timed the rat that was starving, like needed food right then and there to go from one end to the other. And then they timed it for a rat that is being just the scent of a cat. Now, deep inside of the rat's brain, it's automatically afraid of cats, even if it has never met a cat. So there's something there biologically. So they had a scent of a cat put behind the rat, and the rat flew through it, and it was exponentially faster than if it was just starving and it needed cheese. Which means that what motivates a rat more? Is it a want or is it a fear? And it obviously shows that a fear motivates a rat way more. Break that down to the human body, and fears motivate us more than anything else. Did you come across anything like that within game theory?
I'm going to argue with that point actually, because I'm going to say that it's a very particular definition of motivate, and it is very short term. It's a very short horizon that you're looking at.
Yes.
But if you think about what motivates us more to invest for 10, 20, 30 years, the way, say, an entrepreneur is doing, I don't think it's just fear. I think there's some other stuff going on there. Fear is probably going to narrow your horizon, your time horizon, and maybe make you less good at investing even. And so I think it depends a little bit on your question. And I think this, if we're going back to the book, I think part of what the book is trying to do is to some extent put a limit on the kind of arguments that we make. Look for the limits and say, when does this argument apply best and when does it not apply best? And can game theory help to clarify that?
I'm gonna take it up with Jordan Peterson. What you said, by the way. No,
Deal. Deal. Just don't name me.
yeah, what you just said is spot on, though, right? It has to do with the short-term window and the long-term window, right? And then I guess basically in a shorter window, why are we so good at maybe coming up on and accomplishing things by deadlines? Because the shorter the window, the more likelihood of it getting done. Because there's something that we need. There's a dead end ahead, and we need it done by that date.
All the distractions, and suddenly we're finally good at getting the distractions out of the way, that the horizons start to narrow.
That's right. But on a longer timeline, it potentially is the want that drives you. So, yeah, maybe in a shorter window, you can basically play towards fear, right? Not making that deadline, losing that job, or whatever it is. but on a longer timeline, you do need that want. And Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, if you've ever read that book, it does identify that individuals on their deathbed, the number one thing they regret is not living a life true to themselves. So they probably played towards their fears a little bit more of not being true to them, or not being associated with a group, or going out and being in the outsider for a little bit. So yeah, I'm with you. Maybe you might have just sold me that the wants are superior on a long enough timeline. It's awesome, dude. Outside of your or outside of your book, is there a website or social media channel that you're on that people can get in touch with you on?
Yes, I'm the only person in the world with my name. So if you Google me, you will find me, and you can reach out to me however you want.
Guys, if you are listening to this on Spotify, it's EREZYOELI. By far, I've never seen anybody with that name. So yeah, he's easy to Google. It's Erez Yoeli. And so man, I'm telling you, this is fascinating. I'm gonna go check out that book you recommended. And is there anything else you want to share with the audience?
No, just thank you.
Man, guys, look at his book, Hidden Games. Everything is a game, and everything, if you look deep enough, maybe has a series of games within it. So, Hidden Games, the surprising power of a game theory to explain irrational human behavior. And I do believe humans are irrational. So, great stuff. And remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life.